So this video we're going to talk about the pancreas, the two hormones that the pancreas is going to release, and then talk a little bit about the types of diabetes. So your pancreas is found tucked up behind your stomach. This has two different types of cells in it. There are some acinar cells, which are going to be have a digestive function, and we'll talk about those in the digestive system. They're going to secrete the digestive juices and digestive enzymes. We also have an area in the pancreas called your pancreatic islets, or your islets of Langerhans, and these are going to be made up of those endocrine cells. There are two different types of endocrine cells. Alpha cells are going to secrete a hormone called glucagon. I like to remember this because glucagon has the A in it, so that's how you remember that it's secreted by the alpha cells. And then our beta cells are going to produce insulin. This is a picture. We'll look at these slides in lab. The dark cells in here and in here, those are those acinar cells that have the digestive function. And then the lighter regions are the pancreatic islets. That we're not going to be able to see a magnification like this, where you can actually tell the difference between the alpha cells and the beta cells. So you're just going to have to be able to identify the islets versus the acinar cells. First hormone we're going to talk about is insulin. Again, insulin is secreted by those beta cells in the pancreatic islets. So what's going to happen is when your blood sugar rises, so you just had something to eat, a Snickers bar, drank a soda with a lot of sugar in it, that's going to increase your blood glucose levels. So your body's going to release insulin. What insulin is going to do, it's going to open up some channels that are in the membranes of all of your body cells. So the target cells for this are going to be most of your body cells. So it's going to open up these channels and allow the glucose to leave the bloodstream and go into your body cells so that your body cells can use that glucose. So that's what it means over here when it says enhances membrane transport of glucose into fat and muscle cells. It also is going to inhibit breakdown of glycogen into glucose and inhibit you from making new glucoses, which makes sense because there's a ton of glucose in the blood. We don't need to make or release any more. So the overall effect of insulin is by getting the glucose out of the bloodstream into the cells so the cells can use it, is it's going to lower your blood glucose levels back down to normal. Glucagon, on the other hand, again released by the alpha cells because there's an A in glucagon, this is going to be secreted when our blood glucose levels drop. So you haven't eaten in a couple hours, we've used up all the glucose that is floating around in your blood freely, so we need to get some more glucose in there, especially if you're not going to be eating for a little while. So if your blood glucose levels decrease, then we're going to release glucagon. Glucagon, the major target is going to be the liver, and it's going to do a couple things for the liver. It's going to tell the liver to do a couple things. One is glycogenolysis, so it's going to break down that large glycogen molecule into glucoses. And then it's also going to do that gluconeogenesis, or formation of new glucoses, by taking other molecules that the body can find and kind of putting them together to form a new glucose. Then it will also release those new glucoses and the glucoses from the glycogen into the bloodstream. So overall, this is going to raise the blood glucose levels back up to normal. So again, glucagon secreted by the alpha cells. It's going to be secreted when the glucose levels decrease. It's going to do all of these things to then overall increase or raise the blood glucose levels back to normal. This slide just shows a pictorial of that feedback loop. So again, if your glucose levels rise, pancreas is going to secrete insulin. It's going to stimulate uptake of glucose by the cells. It's going to convert glucose into glycogen, keep glycogen from breaking down. That's going to bring the blood glucose levels back to normal. On the other hand, if your glucose levels fall, pancreas is going to release glucagon. That is going to tell the liver to break glycogen down into glucose, also to form new glucoses, release all those into the bloodstream, and bring those levels back up to normal. Looking at diabetes, our homeostatic imbalance of the pancreas, we have two different types, type 1 or type 2. These used to be called youth onset or child onset or adult onset. We don't really use those terms anymore because they found that they are happening at all different ages, not necessarily conforming to those age limits anymore. We'll talk about this in a second. But what I want to talk about is here and exactly what is diabetes. So normally when this insulin is working normally, when you're releasing enough insulin and when the insulin is working properly, again, when we have glucose in our bloodstream, we're going to release some insulin. And what the insulin does is it's going to bind to a receptor on the cell. And when it binds to the receptor on the cell, that is going to open up those channels and allow glucose to go from the bloodstream into the cell so that the cell can use it. Okay, so again, that's what happens when you don't have any disease, any diabetes, and everything is working properly. In type 1 diabetes, what happens is you're not producing insulin or enough insulin. So when glucose enters the bloodstream, there's no insulin available. The insulin doesn't bind to anything on the cell, and then glucose can't leave the bloodstream and go into the cells, so it just stays in the bloodstream, and then you have these really high blood glucose levels. So that's your type 1 diabetes. Again, type 1, you don't produce insulin or you're not producing much at all. On the other hand, in type 2 diabetes, you're producing insulin, but for some reason the insulin isn't working properly. So here you can see glucose is entering the bloodstream, so your body does what it's supposed to do. It releases insulin into the bloodstream, but then for some reason when the insulin binds to the cell or it can't figure out how to bind to the cell properly, that doesn't allow the glucose to leave the bloodstream and go into the cell. So even though you're releasing insulin, the insulin isn't working properly, so it can't exert its effects, so the glucose can't leave the bloodstream and enter the cell. So the result is the same, where you still have high blood glucose levels, but it's for a different reason than the type 1 diabetes. So all of that is stated here. Again, type 1 they used to call juvenile onset. This is an autoimmune disease, so for some reason your body is attacking those beta cells that are creating the insulin, so they don't produce the insulin. This is the type that requires you to have either injections or a pump, and you'll have to check your glucose levels throughout the day. Type 2 is our non-insulin dependent. They used to call it adult onset. Again, insulin is produced, but cells aren't going to respond to it. In this one, they found that usually they can control it with diet and exercise and monitoring blood glucose levels. There are some medications that you can take for type 2 diabetes, but those aren't insulin. What those are medications that are helping your cells use the insulin properly. Again, you're releasing the insulin, your cells just can't use it properly. So these medications are kind of aiding in that, helping those cells open those channels to allow the glucose into them.